Muito obrigada pela oportunidade de apresentar esse trabalho aqui. I'm going to switch to English. I've been in the United States for 18 years and my academic life has been in English, so I can try to present. I can probably code switch or do some translanguaging, but I presented on this like only in English, so it's weird. If I were to present in Portuguese, I guess I'll have a hard time, but I can try. But I think I'll mostly stick to English. But I'm, if you want to ask your questions in Portuguese, of course. Sou brasileira de Porto Alegre. So let me share my screen. And into presentation mode. Let me see if I have everything. I think I have everything I need. Okay. So I'll be talking about pronominal variation in Brazilian Portuguese tweets. I'll be addressing a lot of the challenges, the methodological challenges of doing this work, and then our findings. Like Marcia mentioned, I'm at the School of Information at the University of Arizona. I got my PhD here in second language acquisition and teaching. I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. That's what I love to do. I have actually a computer science degree from URGS. And then I migrated to, my research actually was in the Departamento de Letras at URGS in my grad letter, which I have an opportunity again to work with after 20 years of my graduation. I love collaborating, and it was so nice to hear about PREDICAR and all the collaboration and like a big research group with so much richness in their research. So speaking of big collaboration groups, okay. So I should mention my collaborators. They are all Brazilian. Marina is actually from Spain, but I consider her Brazilian as well. I think she might be here. We started this research group from this interdisciplinary need, actually, to have more of like combined technical aspects to language study aspects to create a more robust studies. I do believe that big research groups are great, like for a number of reasons, and I think we should see more of that, right? Instead of like single author papers. So here are some, actually our group has grown since we started in 2020 during the pandemic. I think a lot of stuff started during the pandemic. And we're always accepting more collaborators. So our first idea to start on this project was to see how social media can be used as a rich source for the study of language patterns. Of course, there's been a lot of studies in social media, but our goal was to address challenges of working with internet language, text mining, and analysis of linguistic variation using logistic regression, for example, in R, to illustrate specifically for this study the use of subject pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese, including orthographic variations motivated by phonology and other factors originated from computer-mediated communication. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but our motivation to use, to look at subject pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese is because there is a lot of literature on this. So we can basically compare what we have with what has been done in language variation and change in the field of sociolinguistics. So let's talk a little bit about the differences when we talk about language data for variation study. So we have traditionally sociolinguistic interviews, which have been historically been used in language variation and change studies. So these are collected from face-to-face interviews and naturally occurring speech. So there is a lot of focus on spoken language. As probably a lot of us know here, that that takes a lot of time, which is not a bad thing because you get to know like your participants and your data. It's time consuming. It's a large number of interviews that require the extraction of these tokens. Sometimes you don't have enough tokens that you need from these interviews. And you have the sample problems, like how do you select your participants. But like I said, the metadata you have from these interviews is very rich. So you have detailed demographic information. Social media has been explored, but not as much as sociolinguistic interviews. So it allows us to scrape or to gather a large amount of data using APIs, and especially Twitter, you can use public data. And you can do that from other social media, but we're focusing here on Twitter. Data preparation is less time consuming, although like we're gonna be talking about, the actual annotation of the data can be as time consuming as for sociolinguistic interviews. Of course, you don't have to transcribe the spoken language to text. So social media actually allows you to extract a large amount of tokens, but not all demographic information is retrievable from social media posts or data in general. Both sociolinguistic interviews and social media posts are great sources that comprise naturalistic data. So we are saying that written data is naturalistic data. The coding process, like I mentioned, is time consuming, although some automation is possible for both. So once you have the sociolinguistic interview written in written format, like in computer readable transcript format, then you can do some automation of token extraction. And like, I think someone mentioned at some point, I'm doing a mini curso tomorrow where I address ways to do this automation, but it can be very noisy, right? You can get a lot of noise from automated processing of language data. Of course, our goal here is to focus on social dimensions in the analysis of the language. So why tweets? So Twitter allows us to retrieve a large volume of public language data and geographic metadata, so you know where people are tweeting from. So language variation can be studied more broadly, since social media language is a different type of written communication, right? And it contains sociolinguistic and linguistic variation, as I'm going to be showing you. And the study of informal writing has been neglected. So Twitter represents an informal written variety that is broadly used by a lot of speakers. And although it's not spoken, that it is different, not claiming it's the same, it's worth looking into that type of data, language. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the variation that we find in tweets. And here I'm showing the variation of the subject pronoun nós versus a gente. So for the first example, you have nós estamos. So this is the standard agreement, right, of nós, with the plural first person verb form, estamos. Nós estamos te mandando outro. And then in the second example, 1B with nós, we have the spelling of nós. Para nós, queria namorar uma cacheada para nós dividir os cremes. By the way, working with tweets is just so amusing. I was laughing the whole time. It's like, I'm glad we have very young people also in the group, because some of the things I couldn't understand what they're saying. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. So then we have the spelling variation of nós. And then instead of saying dividirmos, which would be the standard agreement of the verb, we say para nós dividir. And then the use of a gente. O problema é que a gente conhece tudo. Eles, porque a gente faz pouca merda. So a gente, you have two types of spelling for a gente. But then the point here is you could say o problema é que nós conhecemos todos eles, porque nós fazemos, right? So here's where the variation comes in. It's like people are choosing one pronoun versus the other, and the spelling also changes, which is fascinating, but can also be a problem for us. Okay, so let's talk more about the challenges with Twitter data. So social media data can be harder to automatically process to the informal nature of texts. So I have an example here. Se tu é rico, ou rica, so this is from tweets. Se tu é rico e usa essa porra de bagulho, so BGL é bagulho, caro é porque alguém em algum lugar, em momento, produziu. Então quer dizer que tu se acha melhor que os outros, porque tu depende para ser melhor do trabalhador que produziu essa merda que tu está consumindo. So, the political nature of Twitter too, right? So here we enter in the issue of standardization of spelling and whether we should even do that. There is no good solution for spelling standardization for Portuguese yet. The automated annotation of tokens is actually based on Floresta Syntactica, which is a corpora collection of corpora from news articles. So even like newer tools like Spacey, definitely Core NLP, they're all based on the same annotated corpora to annotate Portuguese language, right? And that does not include tweets or even at web language. So for Portuguese, Brazilian or otherwise, we do have a lack of good tools for automatically annotating language, naturally occurring language. So here we have to deal with the orthographic variation of a lot of these words and the tokens that we are focusing on. So I'm gonna contextualize our study a little bit more. The gap we saw was that pronominal system variation has been extensively studied, but not on Twitter data. So if you look at the literature, there is a lot of pronominal variation, which is exactly why we decided on pronominal variation for Twitter, because we have something to compare against, or like see like how do our results with Twitter data compare with the vast literature we have on this. And on the other side, the study of linguistic variation on Twitter data has become more common only recently and has a strong focus on English and some Spanish as well, but not the kind of variationist study that we are trying to do here. So our focus is on Brazilian Twitter pronominal system variation. We focus on first and second person pronouns in Portuguese. And like I mentioned, we are taking a language and variation approach. All right, so let's talk a little bit more of pronominal variation in Brazilian Portuguese. So innovative pronouns have been introduced to Brazilian Portuguese through grammaticalization of nouns and other pronouns, with the idea of individualizing or disambiguating the referent. And I'm gonna be talking a little bit more. So the choice of subject pronouns in modern Brazilian Portuguese is determined by linguistic and extra-linguistic factors. So for first person subject pronoun, we're focusing nós and a gente. A gente is the innovative pronoun that has been introduced a long time ago. But nós is the standard, right? So nós vamos, a gente vai. Yeah, and I'm gonna give you more examples. Second person singular you, we are focusing on tu versus você. So tu would be the original pronoun, and você is very broadly used in Brazilian Portuguese. So for first person plural pronoun, we have the standard nós comemos. Notice that nós comemos hoje, nós comemos ontem, it's kind of the same, it is the same form, right? So Shahi and colleagues, they propose that the use of a gente, or the use of the non-standard agreement with nós, comes into Portuguese to help make the distinction between past and future, past and present, sorry. So you can say nós come, which is different from nós comeu, or a gente comeu, right? So nós comemos is the standard, but it is ambiguous. We're also looking at second person singular subject pronouns. So we have the marco de você, which is generally used across Brazil. And also, like, if you look at most soap operas and, like news broadcast, você is the standard used in Brazilian Portuguese. In the South, where I'm from, Rio Grande do Sul, we use tu without the agreement, tu vai instead of tu vais. When I was teaching Portuguese here at the University of Arizona as a graduate student, I had a hard time trying to do the correct agreement because it doesn't come out, right? It's like tu vai comes out, tu vai, never tu vais. So tu vai, due to our agreement, Sherry and colleagues have shown that it's used in other parts of Brazil as well. Tu with agreement is still processed in Brazil, but it is more common with Santa Catarina and Paraná areas. So, okay, so we were set that we're gonna look at subject pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese. We did limit our envelope of variation to subject pronouns because you do enter into more decisions when you go to object pronouns, right? So we said, like, okay, we're looking at expressed subject pronouns. So with that in mind, we sampled tweets by location. So we decided on the locations, and then we did a multi-stage sampling, basically. And we collected our data in 2020. So the data was collected using the API offered by Twitter and the R package RTweet, which makes it very easy to do this process. And then what we used for location was geolocation codes for 7 major metropolitan areas. So on a Twitter profile, you can say where you're from, but you can enter anything there, right? So you have location and you have other information on your Twitter profile. That is not reliable, one, because people can enter anything on these on the location field. So we opted, based on also the previous literature, to use geolocation codes. That does add noise to our data. So we assume that our corpus represents a younger and wider population compared to the general demographics in Brazil. Of course, not everyone is on Twitter, although it seems like that sometimes. But we cannot assume that Twitter language is representative of Brazilian in general, Brazilians in general, or Brazilian Portuguese in these areas. So approximately 40% of tweets were retained for analysis after we hand-coded them. And we eliminated a lot of them. There were song lyrics or quotes. Retweets were eliminated from when we were collecting or retrieving these from the API. So no retweets. And then we had to hand code them to eliminate music, like songs and lyrics, and some other quotes. And we have someone here in our group, Isabella, that was really great at identifying when someone was tweeting some lyrics out. Okay, so this is a general overview of our corpus, the tokens, right? So we have the 7 locations: Florianópolis, João Pessoa, Porto Alegre, Recife, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, and São Paulo. These were selected according to the previous literature, what we had for previous literature. Of course, that most studies, they don't combine first person and second person, they study them individually. But we retrieved tokens for all of these locations for both variables. So we ended up with, so my numbers don't, sorry, these numbers here are the ones that count. 2,400, 2,700 for each one of these. All right, envelope of variation. I hinted at that a few times. So following Dagliamonte 2012 and the idea of envelope of variation, we just allow context where the variation could occur. So you could replace nós with a gente and vice versa. You could replace tu with você and vice versa. That's why we ended up not looking at object pronouns. That would make things a little harder. So we were focusing only on subject pronouns. Also, we looked at contexts that are not categorically encoded with just one of the variants, right? So like, I cannot give you any examples. Like we didn't have this problem either really with subject pronouns. Like if you go into like pra mim, like that's why we didn't go into objects, because you had more of the either você or a gente. So we looked at expressed subject pronouns only. We did not look at when the subject was omitted, although that's, you know, Portuguese is a pro-drop language, so that's totally possible, although we know from the previous literature that Brazilians have a tendency to almost always express the subject. But we didn't, we just retrieved tokens that were expressed. So for the process of retrieving tweets, we wrote a greedy regular expression that we retrieve other word types, like prepositions, object pronouns, and then we hand-coded each tweet. So our problem, like I mentioned, was that we know from the literature and from looking at tweets that sometimes we have a lot of variation, spelling variation, orthographic variation of these pronouns. So we thought of all the possible different spelling variations that we could have, like a gente junto, a gente separado, a gente, A-G-I-N-T as a one word, and so on. So here's why we couldn't do this automatically. And we ended up getting, basically retrieving all of the tokens from, you know, 7 to 10 days prior to data collection that contain these strings, basically, right? So on the left, I have the tokens that were included in the analysis. And on the right, I have tokens that were eliminated from the analysis. You can see in the first example, we have NOS with no diacritics. Só que nós vivemos ataques. So in this case, nós is the subject pronoun we were targeting, we. But on the right, example number 1, infelizmente, esse direito nos foi tomado. So nos, in this case, is not the subject, right? So that was eliminated, but the spelling is the same. And then number 2 on the right, from tokens that was eliminated, of course, we have the in the contraction, e tu nos meus sonhos. So nos there is not the subject pronoun we were looking for. And then number 2, on the tokens that were included, we have the same string, NOS, vou aí qualquer hora para nós tomar uma gelada. So nós, in this case, is the subject pronoun, nós tomarmos would be the standard. And then in 3, we have, from the tokens that were eliminated, we have nós with a diacritic, but that is probably like either an autocomplete problem, or the person is so used to typing with the diacritic that instead of typing NOS, they did the diacritic on O, but that's not what it means. Like the person, mas nos últimos dias, nos is the in the contraction there. So we can see how this would be very hard for a automated system to be able to identify. We could try to do it, but we decided to go the hand coding route here. All right, so I also like to quickly mention that for the coding process, once we had those tweets retrieved, and then we have to code each one of them and decide if they're going to stay in the analysis or not. I developed an interface for coding, because when you have 10 different people coding for a number of different variables on the same token, what happens is that you have a lot of variation on what people enter. If you allow them to enter free text, right? So this was kind of the second round of coding. we coded the first round by hand, like of course on a Google spreadsheet. But then we decided which variables we were going to use. And then I designed this custom interface for coding where basically you are limited, well, not limited, but instead of entering the text, you select a lot of the options for especially verb agreement, tenses, mood, and in this case, the token here is pois você não sabe, so there is a negation there. And I also like to decide whether we're going to include that or not. So this made our coding a little bit cleaner, although we had to go back and discuss a lot of these things were not straightforward. Even for like something like for verb agreement, we had a lot of meetings to discuss how we would code these. Okay, our analysis. So like I mentioned many times, we're doing a variationist sociolinguistics approach, which is, pioneering quantitative methods for language analysis. Naturalistic data is very uneven. ANOVA was the statistical method used before the 1970s, and ANOVA is great. It's been used by a lot of linguists out there, but language variation and change specifically has been using logistic regression for a while. This is what we used to decide whether which of the two, você or a gente, and the other variable, nós. Sorry, I mixed up my pronouns, nós versus a gente, and then você versus tu. So binary variation there. I'm reporting here probabilities and not factor weights. All right. But if you have questions about factor weights, I can, we can talk. So let's look at our results. I'm looking at my time. I'm good. So I'm going to be presenting results only regarding variation across location, geographical location. So this is the results for first person plural, a gente versus nós. A gente is used as the reference. So these probabilities are the probabilities of a gente being used instead of nós. So you're going to see that for a gente and nós, a gente is used for commonly for most of the regions, and that's very common. It's based, it's seen in the literature that Brazilians prefer a gente to nós in most contexts. So we have, and the bars are 95% confidence intervals coming from the logistic regression model. You can see that for most regions, there is overlap from São Paulo, Florianópolis, João Pessoa, Salvador, Recife. It's around 80% of a gente probability as opposed to nós. Porto Alegre is a little lower, but there is some overlap with São Paulo. And what we see here is Rio de Janeiro being apart from everyone else, which was a surprise for us. It's like, why are people in Rio tweeting out tokens with nós instead of a gente? So looking at previous literature, you can see that our results are probabilities. Previous literature is percentages, a little bit different. But you can see that we have a match for João Pessoa, Florianópolis, and Porto Alegre. And Rio is weird. It's like, why is Rio so low? And again, Isabella is from Rio, and she was very interested in this problem. So she dug a little deeper. And then what we saw is that nós with the third singular agreement, like nós vai, is highly, so nós is highly retained in Rio, and 78% of these tokens are used with the singular, the known standard verb agreement. So we're exploring more of why nós is being retained in Rio. It can also be the case that this nós vai, that it may be an index of local identity, right? Which could be more easily found in Twitter because it's the last monitored discourse in comparison to other written data. Or maybe it's Português de arremedo. I don't know. We don't know. We have to look more and code these tokens for pragmatic purpose, which is very hard to do. So we're discussing the schema still on the referent and if it's general or specific and how to do that pragmatic coding. Moving on to second person singular. So this is tu versus você. No surprises here. We know that Porto Alegre, where I'm from, we use tu a lot. So tu is the reference, so it's the innovative pronoun. So 66% probability of tweets with tu in Porto Alegre, 6% in São Paulo. You can see like São Paulo and Salvador are the lowest probabilities of using tu. Florianópolis and Porto Alegre are the highest. And that matches mostly the previous literature. What we see here, again, our results, these are probabilities from the logistic regression model. And previous literature, these are mostly percentages. They are percentages. So you can see that for both Porto Alegre and Florianópolis, which are the regions that we know use tu more often, that the probability of tu use is a little lower than what previous literature has shown, while places like São Paulo, Salvador, and João Pessoa is a little higher. So places that are traditionally or historically or in the literature, we know that use você more often. We see that our probabilities are a little higher than what we see in the previous literature. And here's where the public nature of tweets might be affecting these differences. So the order is basically the same, right? We have the South, Porto Alegre, and Florianópolis being at the lowest use of você, or the highest use of tu, and then Salvador, São Paulo being at the lowest use of tu. So how can we explain these differences? Again, we would have to go for pragmatic purpose, but this might be explained by the stigma associated with tu, for example, and the idea that tweet is a public form of discourse, and then people might be adjusting for that type of discourse. But then how do we explain that, Salvador and São Paulo, we have higher numbers? So I'll remind you here that we're going by geolocation here. We don't know if these people are tweeting from São Paulo are actually from São Paulo. So we account for that type of noise from the nature of the kind of metadata we have. All right. So final remarks. I've been talking for a long time. I feel like I've been talking for a long time. So Twitter is a valuable resource of data for the study of language. And I would love to see more studies and support more studies to look at Twitter variation, language variation. We had to hand code. We felt like we had to hand code the current data to the variability in the orthographic forms. However, we are planning to use the data that already coded as a corpus for training a model to automatically annotate these. We would, again, like to express that the idea of bigger research groups should be normalized. And I was really happy, again, to hear about Predicar. And I would just hope that we continue with our work in this group for the next 18 years, and include more interdisciplinary people and groups to account for the different types of data and analysis we have to do, because it's a lot of data. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much. And now I think we have a few minutes for questions.